Oh, good. Now people can ask questions. I think the best thing would be if people want to raise their hands. I think I can call out who has a question or something like that. Some people I recognize. Hi, Lucas.
And Lucas,
I see a lot of return.
Lucas asked him really tough questions.
Is Lucas in the north of Norway somewhere?
Yeah, let's let Lucas go first.
Lucas, you go first.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Simon. I have a piece of type from you from last session I attended, where the weights of words or something like that, I think was the title of it.
Oh yes, the weight of language.
It did arrive, in case you wondered.
Oh, good.
No, I hope it's this question you thought I was wondering about the type neutral exploration, I think is the term you used.
Right.
And that is something I would really like to understand a little bit better. What you mean by neutral? I can't type be neutral at all. I mean, is it like Helvetica, or what are we talking about?
Okay, I mean, it would have probably been useful had I shown an example, but it looks so deadpan and kind of, why are we looking at this, that it wasn't really worth showing. No, what I mean by that is, you know, when you have a word, let's say it's, I don't know, whatever the way it could be, you know, let's say the word Fuji in this case, and so I asked the students to do just simple typesetting. Not choosing fonts that they like. That's not the point of this. The point is to analyze the forms that they're given within the words, so that when you see Fuji in all caps, for example, you know, you get the square corner of the F, whereas in lowercase you'll get a curve. So if you're seeing it all in lowercase, you'll then see that the curve of the F almost mimics the curve of the J, and they kind of parallel one another, and that may give you a design idea. In uppercase, you get the I and the J quite close to one another. When you analyze the forms as well, even in 4 letters, you know, the F feels like it's pointing to the right. The U is symmetrical through its center axis, so more neutral. The J kind of faces to the left, and the I is again neutral. So it's really just observing the shapes, the differences between uppercase, differences between lowercase, upper and lowercase, serifs, sans serifs, slab serifs as well. And just as a way of kind of observing what the forms give you. Because there are you can use those typesetting studies as catalysts for design ideas. So the one that I didn't show you, imagine if we saw the initial type studies of the Fuji progression that I did show. It was really just an observation from the student that with that word in lowercase, you happen to get these 2 dots at the end of the word. And she started to equate those with vision, with looking, with optical qualities. And so that's what generated some of her ideas.
So to clarify, I mean, what you're saying is basically take the word, randomize the typography, so that you try and find different things and see what kind of patterns you can find reoccurring depending on what randomized typography you have.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, imagine just doing everything in 24 or 36 point. Let's say it's a book cover for Franz Kafka. This has happened in a different assignment for students where they're just doing a book cover, but looking at what qualities are inherently in those letter forms. And in a way, one way of thinking about it that's quite useful. It sounds a bit strange, but think of it as it's like a hidden gift. There's a gift inside the words, and your job is to sort of find it. When you see Franz Kafka in all caps, for example, the number of letter forms that have angles, the A, the N, the K, and then the K again and then of the second name Kafka, so the K, then the A again, and then the second K, and then the second A. So it starts to build up. Whereas if you see it all in lowercase, in a serif, you know, it's nice and round and friendly and doesn't have any of those qualities. But in caps, suddenly you see the angles, and the sans serif will bring it out more than the serif. And so any word that you've got, any title, any language for any project, I think especially if you're trying to build a particular typographic, what I called, what did I call it? A particular configuration. we can think of it as an identity, but it can just be, you know, a strong typographic unit for that name.
Simon, so, you know, we talk about, I mean, we use the word form a lot, right? And getting students to understand what that actually means to what they're actually doing is really important, especially in terms of typography. One of the things that I tell my students quite often, especially now, because we're all looking at things digitally on a screen, is, you know, I mean, we've all heard the saying form follows function, but the idea of form as the thing and the shape, I tell my students quite often, you know, you really need to look at things in large scale, especially typography, to get a real sense of the beauty of the form itself and what it looks like. And the shape of it, right? So because students are we're so used to seeing things, and depending on what our screen size is, what I tell students often is, you guys, when you look at typefaces, it's one thing to look at a complete character set, including glyphs and things of that nature, but if you're only seeing them at the largest size, let's say 24, 48, or 60 point, you're really not getting an opportunity to see what the form actually is. It's not until you really scale it up and look at it at a large scale that you actually see the beauty and the shape of the forms itself. And then that way you can make those relationships and connections.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's important, the scale issue. I think if I can just touch again on this idea of one of the reasons behind the, you know, Lucas's question about seeing the simple, just really being analytical about what forms you're working with in order to be able to see whether some of them will generate particular design ideas. And so we were just talking about form, and the main thing I would say here is that one of the things students have to understand, which they find a little bit difficult sometimes, is they're taught, and it's typically the case, you know, you get the concept first, and then you make the form to fit the concept. What I also tell them is that the inverse can happen. What I mean by that is, as designers, we can use form itself as a language, as a tool, as a research tool, in such a way that once we make certain observations about form, we can then, as it were, what I call reverse into the conceptual parking space. We can allow the form to help give us ideas. So it can just be the fact that playing with form, the form makes you think of something, gives you an idea about, okay, in this typeface, rather like I was mentioning about that Donald Judd book cover. It's a very simple bit of typesetting, but it came about through, it looks, I think, very, very sophisticated because it came about through observations of what was happening within that particular geometric typeface in relation to Judd's work. But in theory, I mean, this idea, this principle holds true for, I think, any words that you're working with, but particular for identities where you're trying to create a unique form. But it can become a kind of form research that then adds to your other kind of research. And then ideas themselves can come from pure formal research. And this is something, pure formal research is something that only designers can do. You know, marketing people can't do that. They can look on Google about something, but as designers, we can play with form without necessarily even having a goal in mind. We can just experiment for the sake of it, and then allow ideas and design directions to come out of that. It's a bit scary because you don't necessarily know where you're going. That's why the idea of not choosing a typeface at first seems a little bit odd. And I tell the students, don't start drawing a logo right away. Don't do that. Just research and allow yourself to become immersed in the language, in the shapes of the words that you're working with, expressed in different forms, and allow them, as it were, listen to them, allow those forms to talk to you and say, okay, this is interesting. I'm seeing that form repeated here, or that shape connects with this. You can generate design ideas from that, what I was calling, I think I called it neutral typeface. I just meant that you're not choosing font at that point. It's not, some students will start on that process when I haven't explained it probably well enough, and they'll come in with their favorite typefaces and think they're doing the right thing. That's not really the point of it. It's not about, it's just really observation, objective observation about what forms does this word give me? And those forms change in upper and lowercase. They change in slab serif to geometrics to italics to whatever it is. So it's just really being observant and using that process as a research tool and a catalyst for ideas.
And I think, Simon, you also I think didn't get to it, but then once you understand the form of the word, of the language, there are certain typefaces that are going to work better with those forms.
Absolutely.
I
Sure.
mean, you know, you can't just say, I like this typeface. You have to say, this is a word with certain letter forms that work well with this typeface. I think
Yeah.
Lucas
I mean,
asked a question, and yeah,
that
in
relates
the chat
back
room.
oh, I didn't see that. But it relates back to what I was saying, what you were saying there, relates back to what I was mentioning about the typeface that the student chose to go next to the Alberta Ballet Company geometric logo. If I saw that typeface on its own, you know, it wouldn't be my first choice for something. It's quirky, it's interesting. The serifs, you know, they have a contemporary kind of, it has a contemporary feel, but put it together with that, you know, the junction of it, that typeface with that geometric form, the chemistry that those two kind of created together, I think was very successful. But one acts as a foil for the other. So you have to have the mark first before that typeface decision can be made, and try lots of other things. So you have one constant element, the mark itself. And then if the secondary typography to happen, you have to try lots of different things against it to see what works. But it's built, it's like a chain of decisions. I didn't really have time to talk about this, but it's a chain of decisions. The mark comes first, then any support typography that works with the mark. Then those two are fixed, and then the display typography can be done in relation to those two, or the institutional typography, what you might call, can be done in relation. So it becomes a chain of decisions, but based on known quantities.
Hey, Gloria, there's a series of questions up in the chat. Do you want to get to those, or because there's one really interesting one that I thought that Carol Ann just put up there. Yeah. Does the research also include researching the meaning of the word, the words you're working with?
Oh. Can I read that? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
You can't, you can't design a logo in Hungarian without knowing what it means. Yeah, absolutely. You really have to know what it means, because then your challenge is to use, as I mentioned, I think, use the rhetoric of form to then amplify that meaning. You're looking for a direct relationship between the form and the meaning, and ideally, you know, in a pure theoretical world, ideally they become one and the same thing. The form and the meaning are one. Yeah. That's what you're looking for. It's hard.
Ty, you can ask some of the questions you weren't able to ask, or you and Simon could just look in the chat.
Well, let's why don't we let some of the other questions that other people want to let them ask some of those questions. I think Dan had a question. Do you encourage them to just draw neutral letter form shapes without using actual typefaces?
Yes, that's part of the process. What I tend to do at the beginning, the beginning of the working process in the 14-week class is we do the first 2 or 3 weeks just dealing with abstract concepts and drawing ideas that relate to and are researched around what the organization does. And though none of those to start with are typographic. So we're just dealing with the idea of, so for example, the girl that did the student that did the Alberta Ballet Company, she did research on body movement and flow. And we actually start with language. We come up with a word list of they have to list, but not edit, list everything and anything they can think of that has to do with their subject matter. And then find some keywords. So pick 8 keywords that are central, are core to the activity of the company, that are capable, here's the key thing, are capable of visual translation. So these aren't words that are, for example, like you hear about when companies have brand goals and they're all written by the marketing people, and they say, you know, we want to be this, that, or the other to our customers. It's not about that. It's about using language as a design tool. So I had them draw up a list of words, and maybe body movement was, or movement in space was one of her themes. And then she might have started, then she has to do drawings around that. So she might have started drawing traceries of circles or flow of movement without any thought of this being a logo. That's the important thing. I don't have them actually start designing logos at all early on. It's just all kind of research around the subject. And I deliberately have them not touch typography until like week, I think 4, so that they're not immediately rushing to typesetting or drawing forms. so that we can then focus 1 week on typography. But I want them to think about the meanings of the words and the themes that are involved in whatever this organization does, to see what can come out of that first, and then apply some of that thinking to the type later on.
Here's another question, Simon, by Hector Torres. He has a question. Hector's question is, can a logo or probably a word mark just be set typography, or does it have to be modified in some way?
No, I think it can just be set type. Obviously, it's interesting to. I mean, sometimes modification is necessary. I'm not sort of fully au fait with all the legal ramifications of whether you can trademark something that is just a straight bit of typesetting.
Right. That's a good. Yeah.
That's not my area. I can't comment on that. But I think you can, so long as you've made one move that. You know, for example, in the Fuji one that I showed you, the typeface that she originally used, the U was a lot wider, but by making the U narrower, she was able to make that internal space the same as the space between the J and the I, and so put that black dot up at the top the same. So there were modifications that were made there. Often you do need to make modifications because sometimes you'll find this is the typeface that you want to use, but there's something about that R or that Q that really doesn't work for you. I mean, there's often cases where, you know, in some typefaces, like a Thesis is a fabulous typeface, but it has the cap Q, the little line underneath, it's not attached to the Q. So when that's in 8-point in text, it looks great. But when you blow it up huge, it looks like it's totally drifting away and separating. So, you know, sometimes you find a face that works and has the voice that you want, but you need to make a modification because it's in the characters that you're using, 4, 5, 6, whatever it might be. You might need to adjust that. It's a good question. Yeah, we might need some legal help with that.
Yeah, you know, we and Gloria focuses on this all the time. We talk about licensing, type licensing, right? This is a big challenge for us as educators, especially dealing with students in terms of using typography. And Gloria, you can speak a little bit more on this. So at ArtCenter, especially with the HMCT, is trying to establish relationships with type foundries to allow students to use typefaces while they're in school, as opposed to when they become professionals. And it really, more importantly, having students understand the sort of constant shift in the ideas of typography and type licensing, right? And the importance of that. Gloria, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, you know, we encourage the students not to pirate typefaces. I know there are different philosophies. Eric Spiekerman thinks, oh, students should be allowed to use anything. No, because when they leave school, sometimes they take with them the fonts that they have downloaded and forget to clean their computer. And then it ends up in a job that they're working with. And, you know, unless they have a scrubbing at certain large organizations, they might end up inadvertently using a typeface that is not licensed. And then you can get into real large trouble. I think that happened with the NBC Universal, by the way. That's how they got sued for $3 million because of someone came in. Rachel agrees. So what we try to encourage students, number one, there's lots of, you know, there are lots of opportunities for students to try typefaces now, you know, Font Stand. I am a big proponent of Google Fonts. Very big proponent of looking at what Google Fonts has to offer as students, because a lot of them are well-designed fonts. You know, again, they're learning basics about typography and use of typography, and there's no reason that they can't work with. You should be able to work with any typeface and be a good typographer. So we're very, very careful here about licensing and teaching students the proper way to use type and image too. It's the same thing. You have to teach your students, I think, how to develop an ethical design studio. And part of it is understanding the ethics of usage of type at the very, very beginning.
I'm just seeing a question here from Carol, which I can address if that's okay. Curious of how the students arrived at the subject matter for the exhibition project. I didn't give them the exact exhibitions. That was up to them to choose the exhibitions. So those were the first two projects that I showed. I think they chose the artists in question. So it's always interesting what they come up with. Actually, I can say that those two projects, that was actually a graduate typography class. But as Ty will attest, sometimes the graduate students, may not have done a degree in graphic design beforehand, so they're coming in fairly raw in some cases and almost at the same level as undergrads. But typically, I do give the subject matter. Certainly for the second projects you saw, the Typography 3, the type conference, I always give them the information for that. And then, as I mentioned, the third batch of work, I always give them a choice of 3. So one cultural, one commercial, and one conference. I think I said all the C's, just to get some variety happening in the room, and so they can each learn something from each other's studies. Sorry, Ty, have you got any other questions that?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, and again, this is about process, all right? And I think somebody mentioned this in the first session, and it's about process time, right? How much time do you give for these projects, right? So we have a 14-week semester, right? And in each of our studio classes, which me and Simon teach, are 5-hour studio classes. And so, Simon, the question is, in terms of the number of projects you give in the class, in terms of process, how much time are you giving students to do, for example, a word mark, and then executing that across multiple media types and things of that nature?
Right.
And how does that process work, in terms of week to week progress?
Okay, that's a good question. So, for example, those posters for the type conferences, that's a 4-week project that I give them. It's the last project that I give them. It's deliberately quite short in terms of the time because I want them to make fast decisions. It's only in black and white, no color to think about. There's just three particular forms to resolve. There's the mark itself, then the mark goes into the poster, and then in the very last week, they show up with a T-shirt and a badge just to show how it operates in different situations. So essentially, we only have really 2 full crits before the final. So it's pretty tight. The first week they have to come in with just initial type studies, obviously black and white only, that whole project. They may have, I think I probably asked them for 10 or 12 different directions. They maybe have 20 or 30 sheets of studies with maybe 6 per sheet. And then from those, we have to try and isolate 3 potential directions that might be worth going for. Sometimes if we have time, we work on it in class to see whether we can make progress in class. So if we see a potential direction in one person's work, I might take out, have a work period for a couple of hours where everyone works on trying to do it. So I might do a speed crit to start with. So we try and isolate things quite quickly because it's, as you know, it's sometimes pretty easy to tell what is not going to work. Sometimes harder to find the jewels that are going to work. So it's a fairly quick turnaround. It's a 4-week project. So really they have the identity ideally after, well, they probably don't have the identity resolved until the 3rd week. But after the 2nd week, I'm asking them to start to test it out in the poster form. So they can soon start to see whether it has potential or not, whether it might become a typographic system, whether the logo itself, the mark is holding up. It might take them 3 weeks of those 4 to resolve the mark. It might take them all 4 because we're still refining it as we're refining the poster. The other applications, the T-shirt and the badge, really come right at the end. Those aren't really the key things. It's just to have a bit of fun at the end and see it in different situations. But I do think it's an interesting test for a student to know that as a kind of test that they don't always wear the T-shirt, but if I've got to wear something here, walk into a room, a public space, and it's got something on me that I designed, I want it to look good. I want it to be something I can be proud of. And so that tends to push them towards putting in a bit more time. They might be emailing me between classes for another phase of refinement, just to be able to look at it one more time. But it's relatively compressed. So those are 4-week, that's a 4-week assignment. The first 2 that we showed, That could be done in 4 weeks as well. But why? The reason it's longer is because because they're grad students, I'm asking to do the interior of the book as well. But as an assignment, you could do that with just, okay, the logo, the typographic identity on the wall of the exhibition, on the cover of the book, and on a poster. And I think that would make a good 4 to 5 week shorter assignment without the interior of the book. But then the other class, obviously, as you know, is a 14-week class, 5 hour per week plus homework. Essentially, the way it's divided is by week 7, by midterm, by week 7, they have to have the resolved identity figured out. And then after that, the second half of the term is all about applications and seeing where else you can go. So I would say one point I was going to make, but I think maybe this is a better venue to make it because we ran out of time, is that if you don't have 14 weeks, and not all colleges have 14 weeks, not all colleges have the possibility, and I think Dan's got a question about this as well. If you don't have 14 weeks or the possibility of a specialist identity design class, what do you do? I would say maybe the idea of guidelines is more sophisticated, and for people that are maybe thinking about graduating and maybe they don't need to do the guidelines. If there's even less time than that, then I would say do fewer applications. Don't worry about websites and every single application, but don't take the time away from the development of the form itself, because that's where everything is really, that's where all the potential lies. That's where everything starts. So once you've got the form, then you can easily apply it to lots of different places. That's not such hard work. Obviously, it's a design challenge in itself to do the website and so forth. But the main things are creating the form, getting the good form resolved first, and then testing it out I always give them posters first to test it out, because that involves imagery. Suddenly the logo isn't the most important thing. It's just the support mechanism. So they have to think about how it relates to secondary elements. If you've got shorter time, and I think that could be done in, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 weeks, you could develop the mark itself and then apply it to posters. And that might be enough to at least get a sense of how the identities function.
Gloria, do we have time for me to ask one more question, or?
One, it's up to you. It's your lunch. It's your lunch time. You and I have to go back to work at,
we're
well, it's my time. It's okay. And I never eat anyway. Go, ask away.
Okay, I just want to, because I think it's important for our attendees to understand this as well. So both myself and Simon teach in the undergraduate and the graduate graphic design departments. Our graduate graphic design department is fairly young. It's only, it's been 4 years now? How long has it been?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Like 4 years. I mean, we had one long time ago that Gloria was actually in, but now we just did a new graduate graphic design department area of study within the last 4 years. And me and Simon both teach in those in that department. And Simon has been teaching undergraduate graphic design. I mean, he was my professor as well as Gloria when I was a student at ArtCenter, and now we're both doing that. So Simon, what I wanted to ask you about is, and we're both experiencing this, is, with such a heavy focus on typography in our undergraduate department, and now having a new graduate department where students are coming in with not nearly the skill sets and the proficiency in typography, getting and doing projects in those classes where students are, especially grad students, are using typography heavily. What do you think the biggest challenges for you have been in terms of knowing what the undergraduate students are doing and versus getting the graduate students to at least get to a point where they can articulate narrative and using typography effectively to do that?
Obviously, our undergrad program, we've had a fairly long time to refine and build the sort of cumulative typographic education over the years. The grad program, that's not the case. Obviously, we've had, you get students that have done all kinds of different, they've all kinds of different degrees. They come from different backgrounds. Some are coders, some are chemists, some are, all over the place. And so some of them are not that familiar with, let's say, learning the language of typography, and they have to have to start from, in some cases, not a lot of knowledge. But I think, as I discussed elsewhere, I think it is a language that you can learn. You can start with very, very little knowledge of it. And if you're an intelligent, creative, and curious person, you can build on that knowledge, and you can really, ultimately the goal obviously is to become fluent in the language of typography. So you have control over it. You can make it say what you want it to say. Some of them, as you know, in grad program, they have less experience, and you find yourself looking at things sometimes and thinking, what do I say about that? Normally, I never have a problem. I can always find something, but occasionally someone puts something in front of you and you kind of go white and think, I'm lost here. I don't know what to say. I had one student like that last term, and we got through it, but it was not easy.
Right.
I don't know if that answers your question, but I do find that a lot of them get very sophisticated very quickly.
Yeah.
In the program. They learn, they're quick learners. They're a little bit older, they're quick learners.
Yeah, I think for me, going back to what you were talking about in terms of form and meaning, I think because the graduate students spend a lot more time on research and writing, what I'm seeing happen is, and we talk about form, that statement, typography is what language looks like, right? Using that as a focal point. I mean, what I'm finding is that, once students start writing and they really focus their narrative, the easier it is for them to, especially in terms of picking typography and type choices, with my guidance, to get them to take and develop a typographic narrative based on their type choices, and then how they refine that, right? You know what I mean? So I think the writing and the research is really, really important, and they do that, and they catch on pretty quickly after that.
Yeah, and I think what's important about that process, and I think I touched on it a little bit with even the third term projects of, making a bag, making a t-shirt. It's making them take ownership of the communication process, whether it's having them write something, so it's their words, it's their language. I think that does work. Having them choose the subject matter, so. If she chooses Donald Judd, then how to make something that's her responsibility to try and connect to that. But to make them have, I don't like the phrase skin in the game, but to have some investment in the content, I think is a really good way of achieving, they have a different responsibility, different kind of connection to the material then.
Sure.
And I think it's a different thing when you've generated your own content, the form that you then give it becomes so much more meaningful for you, because it's not just something someone's given you, it's something that you've generated. So I think that's a key thing. If they can take ownership of the content, then it changes the mentality about the responsibility of the form to relate to the meaning.
Yeah, and for me, I find that, the fact that they haven't gone through the rigor of the undergraduate program with typography, I think sometimes, I think for undergraduates, I think it's good because you can learn all of those really essential skills that you need. But for graduate students, I think the thing that I'm finding since I've been teaching in the graduate program is the spirit of discovery, right? That, not having all of those, to worry about all of those rules necessarily, but to focus on content and voice and narrative. I find that by the end of the 14 weeks and they start presenting their final projects, I feel that they're so much more organic to me personally than they would be in the undergraduate program, which I really enjoy.
I think they're probably better because it can happen more quickly. They're better at the broad strokes, the gestural, the expressive.
It's the broad strokes. Yeah, I agree. The details sometimes are not quite there, but the broad strokes to start them.
Which is what I was talking about which is what I was talking about earlier in terms of Simon. One of the things, especially in the undergraduate program, is what's so good about his courses is that attention to detail comes through, and you saw that again in the projects that you showed earlier.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk to them about is try to drill into them the fact that everything you're making is a visual equation, and every element in that equation has a relationship with every other element. and it's only as strong as the weakest link in that equation. So even the 6-point credit on a poster, the position of that is just as important as the headline, because every single element has a relationship with everything else on that field, whatever it is. And so that equation has to work. You know, if 2/3 of that equation work and the other thing doesn't, the whole thing just kind of falls apart. So that's where the sense of detail and attention to detail becomes important. And if once they get that, it's, you know, they can work with it. It's just not being lazy about certain, you know, it's not just the headline that's important, it's everything.
Yeah. Well, with that, I have to say thank you to everyone for coming to this session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Ty. And we'll see everyone later. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.